Now then, Year 11, this is the guide to the exam for Unit 3, Weimar and Nazi Germany, 1918 to 1939. This exam is 1 hour 20 minutes, it's worth 52 marks, it's 1.5 minutes per mark. You have to answer all the questions on this paper, there's absolutely no choices at all. Question 3, 3A, 3B, 3C and 3D come with a source booklet, so the sources to go through on this paper is why the exam is slightly longer than the crime and punishment exam. So let's get started in our pre-exam talk. This gives you an overview of the 6 different questions that you face on the Germany exam. If you'd like to look at this in more detail, then give it a pause and read that information in a little bit more depth. So let's get on with it. Question 1. This question is worth 4 marks, so you should spend around about 6 minutes on the question. You will be given a source. It may well be a visual source, it might be a poster or a photograph or something like that, or it might be a written source. It's usually a primary source that you'll be given. And the question will say, give 2 things that you can infer from the source about a particular thing. Infer means what you can work out, so you want to use phrases such as, I can infer that, and basically you need to make 2 inferences. You get 1 mark for a correct inference and 1 mark for supporting evidence from the source. So you need to quote the source. Remember, quotes should be like baby crocodiles, short and snappy. So you're going to use a phrase like, I can tell this because in the source it says that, and then include a very brief quote from the source. If it's a picture source, just say what you can see within the source. So this is an example source here. In the exam booklet, they actually direct you towards making your inference and then saying what the details in the source are. So you write your inference in here and then the details in the source that tells me this. Note that they only give you a few lines, so please don't write too much for this question. You want to kind of get in and out on this question. 6 marks, 6 minutes maximum, and then you can get on to some of the longer questions. So there will be an example answer. So question 2 is an explain why question. This is very similar to the crime and punishment exam. Question 4, which is also an explain why question, and the exam technique is exactly the same. You need to give 3 factors. You need to make sure you use the bullet points, but then you bring in some of your own knowledge as well. Focus on point, evidence and explanation. To get the highest marks, you want to bring in some of your evaluation skills. So you're going to be judging which of the factors are the most important. But you only actually need 3 factors, 3 paragraphs. You don't need an overall conclusion for this question. So that's how you go about doing question 2. Now it's worth 12 marks, so it's quite worth quite a lot, this question. You want to spend 18 minutes on it. I would suggest you'll be writing at least a couple of pages in the exam booklet, so you do need to go into a lot of detail, and some of you have found that you haven't always gone into enough depth and detail on this question, so it's really important that you just bear in mind it is worth 12 marks. So when you get on to question 3, you're going to have 2 primary sources to read and 2 secondary sources to read. Question 3A is a usefulness question, and these will usually be primary sources, and the question will say how useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into a particular event. Make sure you stay focused on the idea of the usefulness of the sources, so don't just describe the sources but say the source is useful because. There's 3 things to look at here. You want to look at content, you want to look at provenance, and you want to look at knowledge. That's really important to do. The best way to think about it is that content is what it actually says. That's colour coded in blue here, content, and then the provenance is the blurb. Sometimes I call it, it tells you where the source has come from. So you need to write about both of those and determine how useful a source is, and then also bring in some of your knowledge. So does it fit in with what you already know? Does it seem like it's giving you the whole story, for example? That's how you go about doing question 3A. For this question, there's no need for introductions at all, so you're going to write the first paragraph on B, the first paragraph on C. Try and quantify as well to get the highest marks exactly how useful it is. So if you don't think it's much use at all, you might say the source is irrelevant. If you think it's really, really useful, of major use, extremely useful, those phrases just help you to give a judgment for this question. The exam technique for that is exactly the same as the crime and punishment exam. Question 3B, you'll go on to read 2 historical interpretations written by secondary historians or from historical textbooks. You have to study those interpretations. And for question 3b, all you need to do is explain how the sources or the interpretations are different. You must write about both sources within your answer and use connectives such as interpretation 1 suggests this, whereas interpretation 2 would suggest something different. Try and focus on the overall impression that you get from the whole interpretation, so not all the individual details, but what does it say overall. So it might be that you get one interpretation that says positive things about the Hitler Youth and one interpretation that says negative things about the Hitler Youth. And you need to be able to quote from the interpretations about how you know that as well. So some useful phrases there for you to think about. That's what the question looks like, and that will just give you an example answer just to help you out. Note here you've got that connective. On the other hand, extremely useful just for comparing the two interpretations. Question 3b is about why the interpretations are different. And you need to think about some of the different reasons why the sources might be different. Now, usually there are roughly 3 different reasons why sources might be different, but you only need to talk about one of them in your answer. It's worth 4 marks, so you'd spend 6 minutes. So probably the best way to actually answer this question is to link it back to the primary sources. All the sources in question 3 are on the same topic. So in the specimen paper, they're all about Hitler Youth, for example. So you might be able to explain that interpretations 1 and 2 have come to different conclusions because they might have used different primary sources, and then link that to source B and source C on the exam paper. You could also talk about how the historians might have a different focus. So one of them might be looking at, say, the social factors, or another one might be looking at the economic factors, or it might be that the historians have taken the same body of evidence but just interpreted it differently. Remember, we looked at this analogy within class to think about that interpretations are often different because historians might interpret the same information differently. They've come to different conclusions. You know, we know in history it's not clear-cut. You can argue that the golden 20s were a golden age, or actually it was an age of instability, or that the Hitler Youth was positive, but then some people found it negative. So this whole analogy, is this a duck, is it a rabbit? You know, depending on how you interpret it, it could be both, and it's worth just bearing that in mind when you're doing question 3C. And then finally, question 3D. Now, quite a lot of you found this question quite difficult the last time we did it, so you really need to hone in on the exam technique required for this. So for question 3D, you take the interpretations that you've already used in question 3B and 3C, and you have to evaluate an interpretation and an opinion. But this time, rather than them giving you the opinion, you have to kind of work out the opinion for yourself. So the question, as this example one says, something like, how far do you agree with interpretation 2 about the attitudes of young people towards the Nazis? So the first thing that you have to do is you have to be able to identify, well, what is the interpretation in interpretation 2? So what my advice would be is to start off this question with an introduction where you outline what that view in the interpretation is, and then give your opinion. The second paragraph, you're going to find evidence to agree, so you're going to evaluate that interpretation using your historical knowledge. You're going to find the evidence which agrees with it and disagrees. And then in the third paragraph, you're going to find, well, what's the counter-argument? So what is the counter-argument to interpretation 2? And that requires you, and this is really important, to evaluate the different interpretation. So in this question, it says, how far do you agree with interpretation 2? So you're going to find evidence which agrees with interpretation 2 here. But then in the third paragraph, you're then going to find evidence which disagrees with interpretation 2, and you're actually going to evaluate the other interpretation. Now, I'll go through this again with you in class, but the most important thing to remember for this question is you have to write about both interpretations in your answer. In the conclusion, you're going to explain which opinion you most agree with. So is it interpretation 2, or might it in fact be interpretation 1? Now, I think this overview probably gives you a bit of clearer advice on this. So you've got your introduction, you've got your second paragraph, you're going to use your own knowledge to evaluate the opinion in the first interpretation. Third paragraph, use your own knowledge to evaluate the opinion in the second interpretation, and then in conclusion, reach a balanced judgment. And that's the best way to think of it. This little overview here, given the opinions of both interpretations at the start in your intro, evaluate the first interpretation, evaluate the second interpretation, and then the conclusion. There's some useful phrases there for you to use, so pause and learn those. Some key feedback points. I mean, question 3D is the only exam question in the whole of GCSE history that assesses what's called assessment objective 4, and that says you must be able to analyse, evaluate and make judgments about historical interpretations. So you need to look at specific parts of the interpretation, break it down. You might agree more with some of the ideas in the first couple of sentences and then disagree less with what's in the second couple of sentences. But the key thing with this question, you won't go far wrong if you make sure you remember you have to write about both interpretations in your answer. Alright, Barak says good luck. With good hard work and revision you can go for that grade 9. Good luck on the Germany exam. Do let me know if you've got any questions. Thanks for listening.